So, Jeff, such an exciting opportunity to be part of your House Views podcasts and put you on the receiving end for the change. And I'm delighted to be able to ask you some questions about your career, your development of this business, and your vision for the future. And I know you like to ask the questions, so hopefully today you will get a little bit of your own back, but why don't we just launch right in? I feel very fortunate. I'm one of the few people still in the industry that remember Jeff before there was an institutional real estate letter, and more importantly, remember the industry before there was an institutional real estate letter. So I guess, kind of first question, if you can think back all those years, what were you doing when you decided that you needed to follow a different path and form the institutional real estate letter? I mean, what was your inspiration? I think many people may know, but if not, we'll reveal you used to be in the fund management world. But what was the inspiration and motivation to kind of take this different direction?
Well, as you know, I was working for a company called Equitech, and I'd started out on the retail side, running the retail sales organization, raising money from individual investors. And then for the last 2.5 years there, I switched over and was raising capital from institutions, which is where I really got exposed to the industry and fell in love with it. In 1986, for a variety of different reasons, we agreed to part company. And I decided that I wanted to do something on my own. And I had been involved in publishing before. So I thought it would be interesting to meld the two. And I did quite a bit of homework. And the thing that I was most impressed with at the time was a publication that was probably most people tuning in would be familiar with, called Institutional Investor. And it had been funded or founded 20 years earlier by a guy named Gil Kaplan, who was an American Stock Exchange analyst. And he was writing for National Real Estate Investor and coined the term institutional investor. So his idea was that the ownership of equities and fixed income was passing from the hands of individuals into the hands of professional money managers, mostly mutual fund managers at the time. And therefore, there was a need for a new kind of information, strategic and top down. And the publication and platform they built was amazing. I mean, it was award winning. They competed with Wall Street Journal and New York Times and won numerous awards. And I was just really impressed with the quality of the journalism they had created. So I thought, same thing is happening right now in 1987. The ownership of real estate was moving from the hands of individual entrepreneurs into the hands of professional money managers. And I thought there was a need for a different kind of information. And that was what really prompted the idea of doing that.
Yeah, very interesting. Because I certainly do remember Institutional Investor. It exists today in a different format, but they also pioneered some of the very early newsletters. I think they were the sponsor of Money Management Letter, for example, which kind of got a little more into the nitty gritty of kind of who was doing what. If you think back to the early '80s, the industry was rather small. I mean, were there 50, maybe 60 managers? It was a very domestic business. When you were starting out, were you any idea what growth might look like for a publication
I
like this?
was very naive, as most people are who start businesses. I had no clue on what was ahead of us. When I first started the business, I tried to get venture capital financing. And when I called, I did a lot of dialing for dollars, trying to get venture capitalists to back us. And I picked, directories. They didn't have databases back then. And I redlined or highlighted all the firms that had invested in magazine properties. So I started calling, and 9 times out of 10, if they invested in a magazine, the answer was, yeah, we invested in a magazine. We'd never do that again.
Never got our money right. Never got our money back.
But the ones that did said, well, let me take a look at your business plan. So I'd send it out. They'd call me back up and they'd say, are you sure you have the right team? Which I didn't realize at the time was venture capital for, you have the wrong team, dummy. And the second thing was, are you sure the market is deep enough? Because of course they were raising money as venture capitalists from the same people the real estate guys were. And at the time it was a very small market. Most public pension funds weren't even invested in real estate at that point in time.
Yeah.
We figured that the market cap of the industry in 1987, entire US real estate, institutional real estate business was about 90 billion. And I looked at our league tables the other day, and there's more than 20 firms with over 90 billion under management right now. So the industry is scaled. It's over, $4 trillion industry today.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it was controversial. I mean, I think I raised my first closed-end real estate fund in 1982, and no one knew what it was and why we were doing it, and well, what's wrong with open-end funds. And a lot transpired quickly, but we're talking about a period of time before PRIA had become a very dominant force. And we found early on investors needed to be schooled. I mean, there was a big kind of knowledge gap. And I was at a firm where we were able to see kind of what some of the European institutions were doing. And they were way ahead, having started a lot earlier. But you really did help kind of frame an industry very early on. And it's interesting because I think about institutional investor. It doesn't feel like you were really modeling your business, your publication after that, other than maybe from the high end quality perspective. They were always a very kind of glossy book, tons of advertising and the content was good, but it was, given that it was a monthly, it was also always a little bit dated. It seemed to serve a lot of different masters where you've really focused on one segment and made it a big kind of recipient of knowledge coming into the industry. Was there a moment when you kind of realized this is starting to click? I realized somewhere between 1987 and 1990, 92 was when it really started to roll. Maybe you could kind of tell us a little about those early days.
it was interesting. It was really tough. You may remember Larry Hull, who was my mentor. Larry was a really kind fella who took me under his wing, and I met Larry about 2 years after my father passed away, and so he kind of became my surrogate dad. And I used to call him up and say, Larry, I've quit worse jobs than this. I mean, I can continue to go on. I'm starving. It's just not working. And he would say, now, son, just settle down. It's all going to work out. You're gaining traction. Just be patient. And I was. It was hard those early years. I didn't have a formula that worked. You know, it, the venture capitalists were right. The market was too small, and there just wasn't enough people to support a paid circulation publication. So it was only after a year and a half of running that we hit upon the idea of a sponsorship program, very similar to a public radio, public television sponsorship program. And the reason we did that was because nobody at the time really wanted to advertise. The real estate industry was, as you say, relatively in its industry infancy in terms of professional money management. And what the guys that were running firms like the ones that you were in, David, and were involved with, they were seeking a Wall Street button-down suspender, pinstripe image. But the industry had more of a white shoe, white belt, gold chain, Texas real estate image, developer image. And they didn't really see advertising as part of what they really wanted to do. There were a few firms that were advertising, but most weren't. So we hit upon the idea of borrowing from public radio, public television to create kind of a sponsorship underwriting program that looked and felt a little more dignified, a little bit more buttoned down, a little bit more Wall Street. And that really was the turning point for our organization.
So when you did that, I mean, you had said early on, and I can certainly corroborate, when you're starting a business, you have your plan. You're never really sure. Well, these plans are created in a vacuum, and you do your best. But did it then become a bit more obvious kind of the diversification that you could bring to the institutional real estate? You talk about the sponsorships. It then evolved to maybe conferences a few years after that. I would say great collector of a lot of data across the industry, and then ultimately working with managers as well as LPs as they kind of took their plans forward. What I just described, was that a 5-year, a 10-year expansion?
Oh no, it was more incremental than that. It was a whole series of trying things that didn't work. Maybe you can relate to that in starting up your own business. You have this vision. Your business plan is always way too big, way too complicated, and way too ambitious for what you're really going to be able to execute. And we tried all kinds of things. We tried gift subscription programs. We tried bulk subscription programs. We tried all kinds of different things. None of them worked. It was only when we hit on the sponsorship program that it worked. And then the other thing that was kind of a turning point was the whole development of our editorial advisory board program.
Yeah.
because people are hungry for connecting with each other. And we were hungry to understand what we should be writing about that would resonate with the investor community. And so by asking the investors, what are the biggest challenges you're facing in managing your portfolios? And what are the biggest concerns that are keeping you up at night? We were able to kind of identify the gut level issues that really were going to be driving investment decision making. And that's what we built our editorial calendars around. So that was a breakthrough moment for us as well. Along the way, we tried all kinds of different publications that didn't work either. We had Real Estate Capital Markets Report, could never really get an edge with that. We had Institutional Real Estate Securities, couldn't grab an edge with that. We tried to convert that into Reed Street magazine, didn't work. So, we tried a lot of things that didn't work along the way.
Well, certainly a testimony to persistence, but your point about understanding what the viewer, what the reader wanted. I mean, that's fundamental to everything. We always say, you can be a great, owner of real estate if you understand end user demand. And I think what you did was you created a mechanism to go to your constituents via the editorial board and understand, as you say, what are the issues that are kind of compelling to them, hurting their heads, things they need to think through. I would also think that with the significant expansion in the early through late 90s of opportunistic funds and really some of the early days of more traditional, now we call traditional, closed-end value add funds, the market itself expanded. Things were pretty static up until late 80s, and obviously with that nasty correction late 80s early 90s, that rolled a lot of people back on their heels, and then it took off. And does that also kind of adjust to a timeline that looks like when you were gaining more traction?
To a certain extent, we didn't really connect with the opportunity fund sector the way we probably should have early on. As Blackstone was coming into the market and Starwood and some of the others. We thought, and mistakenly, I mean, I'm not the brightest tool of the shed. I don't know food trends. Um, we thought the opportunistic was going to be kind of a flash in the pan, just a reaction to, the meltdown of the savings and loan industry. The cheap assets, and after the cheap assets were gone, so were the opportunity funds. We couldn't have been more wrong. It really took hold. And the other
Well,
thing
you
that
weren't.
I
Yeah,
thought you recall, David, is Kimco went public. And that changed the whole face of the public real estate market, which had been kind of a sleepy, advised, very small market cap market,
yeah.
70 billion. And it exploded. And all of a sudden, we started seeing players that have been traditional investment managers like A&B Property Company moving over and going public. So the whole world changed. It really went through a massive, massive restructuring of the industry during that period of time. And,
Well, I think.
while we didn't always see it coming, we were there to chronicle it. And I think that's the role that we really played.
Yeah. Well, you were not the only one who thought opportunity funds will exist as long as there's an opportunity. And as I learned late into the 90s, well, there's always an opportunity, so it's always good to have some opportunistic capital available. I sometimes wonder if the kind of ubiquity of opportunistic capital in a way has changed the real estate cycle, because you don't get that full cleanse you used to in the old days when the capital was really scarce. Now, a lot of capital is just waiting to pounce, and does it almost like correct it before before you have a chance to report it, almost.
I think the opportunity fund, the emergence of the opportunity funds was a huge boon to the consulting community
Yeah,
because you look at the dispersion of returns amongst the open-ended funds and the separate accounts, it isn't that great. It's pretty narrow.
yeah,
So it's hard to really add value, but the dispersion amongst opportunity fund and value add fund managers is quite wide. And so picking winners is really a skill that these guys had to develop. And no, no, I should assume some have been more successful than others. We don't really track performance numbers, but my guess is it really was a boon to the consulting community. The other thing that was interesting is to watch the consulting community eventually move itself into the asset management business, um, which I don't think was something that was totally premeditated on their part. What happened was, Townsend and a few others started getting mandates of sub-advisor type account mandates with the Bank of Ireland and some big family offices in Chicago and what have you. And it was pretty clear to them once they started doing that work that it was a hell of a lot more profitable than consulting side of the business. And so that's evolved. And then the other thing that happened is from the time that we started, actually from 1974 on, the corporate pension fund market, which really dominated the capital flows in the early 80s, has slowly moved away from defined benefit pension funding into defined contribution pension funding. And that had pretty significant implications because over time, initially, it didn't have much impact. Corporate funds were still flush with cash and still investing. But over time, once you freeze, you reach a point where your asset
Yeah.
base flattens out at the top and then it starts to shrink. And when it starts to shrink, the powers that be go, why are we even funding this thing with human resources? Let's just outsource it. And so we saw both the evolution of dedicated bond portfolios and the emergence of the outsourced CIO. And so that is another thing that's happened to the consulting community is they really played a big role, stepped into that role of taking over the outsourced CIO role away from internal plan sponsors managing their own assets.
It's interesting you raised that because I was commenting to a colleague earlier about who were the big investors back when this industry was rolling forward. It was the corporate pension funds, and you think about General Motors and AT&T probably single-handedly helped create the opportunity fund industry going forward, and effectively neither one exists today. I mean, there's subsequent businesses, but they're no longer in the business. And I think to you, when did you realize, okay, we've got to be more global? For example, when you started to see that, as the capital was shifting, you had a strong position with the public pension funds in the U.S., but increasingly it was a lot of ex-U.S. capital, increasing, right to this day.
Well, I'd like to think that we were leaders in the industry, but I don't think that's a fair assessment. I think we were followers pretty much. And we followed you guys. We followed the investment managers because you were in the investment manager side then in those days. And it took a while. We were a little bit late to the party. But I would say around 2006, 2007, we started our first um, European publication. And we followed the next year with an Asia Pacific publication. Larry, my mentor again, had been pushing us for a long time to do this because he had founded an organization called the Pacific Pension Institute out of San Francisco that's still active and involved. More of a private equity shop, but a version somewhat patterned after what we had originally developed. And he knew a couple of things that we weren't aware of. One is how fast the institutions were starting to move offshore. The investment management community was starting to move offshore. And secondly, the emergence of infrastructure, which he pushed really hard for us to get into. But again, it wasn't until 2007 that we started institutional investing in infrastructure, started doing infrastructure conferences.
In addition to the print publications, you have been prolific in the conference world. And I always hear people say, I'm going to Dohrmann's conference. They don't refer to it as IRE, but it's Dohrmann's conference. And, VIP is generally regarded among the best industry conferences year after year. So you went from publishing this kind of go-to, publication for the growing real estate private funds world to organizing conferences. What was it that kind of precipitated this expansion? I remember you used to lead panels and sessions at PRIA, and then I think the next logical step was, well, maybe we can be the attract our own.
We've been big supporters of PRIA, and PRIA really plays a really important role in our business. And does a phenomenal job of putting on conferences. So we didn't do it really had anything to do with PRIA. It really had to do more with a, a conference that you remember very well called Real Estate Investment for Pension Professionals. And it also used to be called the Utah Conference because the state of Utah Investment Board decided they wanted to get education for their board. And they thought, well, let's do it for other pension funds. They probably also want it too, because public pension funds were just starting to get active in real estate. So they hired a guy named Glenn Laufenberg, who had an organization called the Center for Northwest Education, and created this real estate investment for pension fund program. And It was running, it was the conference in the industry. Everybody went to it. It was wonderful. And they used to get about 800 people, which was huge.
And
You know,
those,
back
yeah,
in
sure.
those days, Priya would have maybe 100, 125. And the Northwest Center was bringing in, 800 people to this conference. And what happened was one day, and Devin Olson told me the story, the board woke up and said, we really don't want to be in the conference business. Let's sell it. So they called Clem up and they said, Clem, we want to sell it. And Clem said, I just did. Clem thought it was his conference. Utah thought it was their conference, but it ended up being Clem that ended up selling it. He sold it to a major conference organizer. And they had a formula for how they ran conferences. And the economics didn't work quite the way that they thought it should work. So they started skinning down certain aspects of it. So instead of having a full blast cocktail party, they had wine and cheese. And it just started getting tackier and tackier and tackier. And so the sponsors, UBS and Amy Cummings and Terry Sander, who was working for PCA at the time, came and said, "You got to do something about this." And I said, "I can't do anything about it. I don't own the conference." They kept saying, "You got to start something. You got to start something." So eventually, reluctantly, kicking and screaming, we started our first one in about 2006. It was the Biltmore in Arizona, and we had maybe 150 people there. And even today, people go, "That was the best," because it was small, it was intimate. People like that. But it's now grown to where we have about 400 people there. But we do things differently at our conferences, David. First of all, we really control the ratio between investment
Yeah,
managers
you keep the numbers are more manageable.
and investors. And we do that because everything we try to do in our organization is focused on the investor. The thesis behind our organization was always if you can capture the hearts and minds of the people with the money, the investor community, then the hearts and minds of the people who want access to it will follow. And so we've always felt that if we could please the investor community and provide and deliver something that would be of value to them, that the investment managers would support it. And that has proven to be true. They have.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Second thing is we wanted them to be interactive. We felt that, in today's age, you don't have to fly 3,000 miles to go listen to somebody speak. You can just click on your computer, click on the YouTube, and just about anybody you could hear speak is going to be on YouTube, right? This will be on YouTube when we're through with it. So you don't have to travel to do that. But what you can't do very well on a Zoom call is have conversations with multiple people um, and maintain dialogue. So roundtable discussions have always been a big part of the way that we curate these programs. Another thing that we do, just again, because of our investor centricity, is we prohibit marketing. And at our events, we have a big brass gong. And if anybody starts to market from the podium, we gong it. Because we want to control the content and make sure that it remains non-marketing related. And we do that partially to protect the interests of investors, but also to help the investment managers, because the normal dynamic between an investment manager and an investor is investment manager pitch, investor resist. That's the normal dynamic, right? And we wanted to break that down. So we figured if we got everybody on the same side of the table talking about issues that were important to the investor community, the managers would be positioned as peers instead of adversaries and be able to accelerate the relationship building process. And I think that formula has proven to be true. And I'm surprised that more people don't do it, but it's worked really well for us.
I think demystifying that relationship quandary between the LPs and the GPs, investors and fund managers, was a key component of that early success. Because Priya pursued that as well, and I think they also they did a good job of minimizing the marketing. But I think everybody knew that was going on behind the scenes. It was always this sense that when you would attend one of your conferences, people stayed in the room. They enjoyed the engagement, and I'd say now more than ever, 20 years later, that's really critical. Because I think, in general, and I don't want to, go down this path, but as a society, we need more actual connectivity. We're the most connected civilization that's ever existed on the planet, but there's more isolation by
Yeah,
how we're connecting.
you remember 1970, Alvin Toffler came out with a book called Future Shock. Everybody was reading. And one of the theses of Future Shock was as we become more alienated by technology, and God, this was 1970 before the internet, right? He was such a visionary. He said, as we become alienated by technology, it forces a human reaction to it. He called it high tech, high touch. And that's proven to be true as well. The more we get disconnected by technology, the more we crave that human connection, that human talk. And that's a big part of why conferences like BRIA also exist.
Yeah.
It's the family reunion for the industry. It's where people go to see and be seen and connect with each other and see old
Yeah.
friends,
Yeah.
you know?
No, you're absolutely right, and I think some of the other conferences that are organized around the world, and I would say, I was recently at an INREV conference where they really do manage the size of it, the scale of it. They try to create that balance. But, as our old friend Gail Haynes used to say, you got to give them take home value. And I think take home value is in part what content you can learn, but also the experience of, a shared experience with your peers, friends, industry colleagues, addressing the same issues at the same time in the same place. It resonates. And I
Yeah,
think, we're going to see conferences more important, not less important in the future.
I think that's
So
true.
if you're old enough to remember Alvin Toffler and Future Shock, then that makes you a visionary too. Because if you read it back then, you knew the world was going to evolve over the subsequent 50 years. So, as you're thinking as a visionary leading a very iconic, organization now between the publications. The editorial board, the sponsorships, the conferences. Where do you see this leading? I mean, I know, expansion into credit and infrastructure, but where do you see this traveling over the next few years?
Well, the nature of content is going to change for sure. AI is changing everything in terms of the ability to get access to content. So, but judgment is still a very important part of it. And so I think one of the things that has set our content apart is never really been news focused. We've never tried to be the first to break news. That's not our mandate. Our mandate is to help people understand trends, to understand how things fit together. And AI helps with that. We have to admit it does, but
Yeah,
it doesn't have always the same intuitive grasp of the meaning, the subtle layers of meaning. And I
yeah,
think that's where we can continue to add value. But I do think the future of our business lies more in the connecting side of it, that the events are going to become more important. And we are expanding our event platform. We're launching Springboard Europe this year. We're launching VIP Europe again. We took it. It was a successful program. We discontinued it during COVID and never brought it back, and now we're bringing it back.
yeah,
We'll probably continue to roll those into um, Asia Pacific region as well. And most likely, we'll also expand our Institute for Real Estate Operating Companies into those markets.
yeah.
So I think events are a very, very big part of what
Yeah.
we'll continue to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, you mentioned Springboard, incredibly important for the industry in terms of creating a forum for our rising leaders. And I know other organizations have other names for it, but where people can kind of begin to build out their peer set across the industry. Because that to me was, early PRIA, early Northwest Center, some of the early events that brought us together, gave you a real opportunity to kind of not just meet investors, but who's the competition? And they became not competitors as much as worthy opponents and friends. And you learn a lot that way. And I think a little bit of that has been lost, partly just because of the sheer scale and fragmentation of the industry now. But I think also when you get together in large groups, the guard is up differently than when you're sitting around a small table with a handful of people and actually speaking, very, openly about the issues and the challenges and opportunities. You need to be careful because what you say can and will be used against you. But at the same time, it gave you an opportunity to build a peer set that you could travel through your career with. And I know that I met people in those early days, which became really some of the touch points for me as the industry evolved. We had a kind of similar origin story. We saw the world in a sort of similar way at the outset, but we also had an opportunity to grow together, and they became, well, who's your trusted counsel? Well, sometimes it's a competitor or a
Yeah,
friendly competitor.
But and you end up helping each other too, which is nice. There's a tremendous amount of collegiality that people don't realize. If this isn't right for me, it might be right for you, and people aren't ashamed or embarrassed to help each other out.
I think that's right. That's been one of the hallmarks of the industry, as I've seen it, is how genuinely rather, collaborative and supportive. The industry has been of one another. Sure, we're competitive when we are chasing down a piece of business, but it gets left at the door when it's time for us to huddle up.
Now, you mentioned size too, and that's another thing I think a lot of people don't think about, but nobody ever goes to a conference much bigger than 110 people. You may go to one that has 30,000 people like MIPIM, but you're only going to see about 100 people. So your
Yeah,
conference is really limited to how many people you're going to be. And our theory has always been just get the people you really want to get together in the same room and they'll all connect with each other. And as Larry
yeah.
Hull used to say, the objective is to try to get to know everybody in the room on a first name basis by the end of the meeting. You can do that in a smaller gathering. It's hard to do in a large gathering.
Yes, well, Larry was a bit visionary back then when everybody was trying to fill the room with as many people as possible. He had the right answer. So
Well, you
you had
know,
mentioned AI, and I just want to kind of tie back to it because you, like a lot of businesses, find we sit on a lot of information and a lot of data, and suddenly you have all these technology tools at your disposal to work with it, not necessarily to do what some of the big firms do, which is scrape the data and sell it back to you or to your competitors, but a little bit more about how to use that as kind of the framework for more editorial content. How are you now implementing technology, given the vast amount of information you sit on now and have for the last 35 plus years?
well, you know that we have a database called IRE.IQ,
I do know that.
and we will never win the battle of having the most data. There are others that are out there that are much larger. We won't say their names, but we all know who they are, who've been around for a long time. What we can do that's useful is not position ourselves as another list generator or another place to go in and slice and dice data. But we can win in the battle for understanding and what I would call real intelligence, right? Because intelligence is not data. Intelligence is what you make out of the data.
Yeah.
So what we've been working on for the past 8 months and getting ready to launch in uh, August is an AI interface, a plain language interface that allow you to query the database in plain language. So that you can go into enter prompts and what have you.
Hmm.
But more importantly, it's not only going to access the data in the database, but it's also going to access all of our content, all of our news articles, all of our publications, all of our research papers that have been posted, videos, audio tapes, everything that's content will be searchable. And and using the intelligence components of AI to synthesize through that data and tease meaning out of it is going to be really powerful. So let's say you're going out to call on Tulare County Employees Retirement System, and you've never been there before, and it's in the middle of Visalia, in the middle of the Central Valley of California, and you can't even get there. You got to drive to get there, right? It'll be able to tell you the whole history of what they've been doing and how they've evolved over time and what their program is all about. It's not something you can get by just querying a database and getting some
Yeah.
factual. And I
No,
think
it's
that's
it's
going to
it's no,
that's gonna,
it's really fundamental in a way. What you're saying is we can serve up the data, but we can also help you interpret it. And I think that is a little bit what's kind of been lacking with a lot of the services that exist today. And as you say, don't need to be a list service. For one thing, it's very hard to really trust these services that are purely putting out reams of lists and it's the managers putting the information out more than it is somebody trying to do on a detailed, realistic basis. What's out there. When I hear there are,
especially when it comes to performance numbers, which I'm a big bugaboo about. I think these databases that publish performance numbers do a disservice to the industry.
yeah, well, that's a dissertation for another day. We'll come back for that one, but yeah, I'd say what remains the holy grail is not just knowledge, but also clean, consistent, comparable data across alternative asset classes. And real estate, you ask any LP what's their greatest frustration is, well, I get all this information. I'm drowning in information, but I'm not really sure what I can rely on.
Yeah.
I give all my managers the same template to fill out, and it all comes back different. And so I think that is something where I think your organization, other organizations are going to continue to chip away at what has been, I don't want to say it's resistance, but everybody does interpret these things differently, and everybody interprets the word transparency differently.
Well,
But I think,
there's some initiatives going on, as you know, like Ready and some other things that Mike McGowan and his colleagues are working on to try to get more uniformity, but it's really tough. In my opinion, what's going to happen eventually is some platform, maybe it's Juniper Square, maybe not. I don't know. I would vote for them. I think they're as good as any in terms of being positioned, will become the main platform that everybody uses. And when that happens, the standards will be baked in to the
yeah,
operating platform.
yeah,
Uh, if it continues to persist in the direction of it being a voluntary compliance system, you're always going to have outliers and people that will find a way to game the system in their favor. And that works to the disadvantage of the investment community, which is why Ready and initiatives like it have been instigated. And of course, the PRIA NACREIF initiative for standardization data has been going on for a long time.
I was going to say, I think we've been having subcommittee conference meetings on that for 30 years. Well, I'm going to throw another hat in the ring, but my new home, Chatham, is looking at this as well because they do a lot of that on the credit side, given the ubiquity of their business there. But we'll as I said, we'll leave consistent reporting for another podcast. I have two more questions for you, if you have a moment longer. And I'm not the first one to ask, but please explain. What is the origin of your favorite expression? It's a wacky, wacky world out there.
Well, first of all, I never really thought anybody would want to read anything I had to write. Um, it was that Mike Torres, when he was at Wilshire, who encouraged me to write an editorial. And he said, you really should write that. And I said, why? Who in the world want to hear what I have to say? And he said, you'd be surprised. You're writing a newsletter. And back then I was writing a newsletter. He said, people want to know what you have to think.
Yeah.
So I thought about that and I thought, well, I got to have some kind of tagline. And at the time, one of my favorite shows was Hill Street Blues. And there was always a scene in Hill Street Blues where the commander was dismissing the troops and he would say, okay, and he
Be
let them
careful
go.
out there.
Wait a second, be careful out there. And so I figured I love that. So I picked up on that. And that's where it's a wacky world. Be careful. Be
Yeah.
very, very careful came from. It was really
Well,
stealing.
you were right. It was and remains a wacky, wacky world, and I figured it was something like that because I too remember Hill Street Blues, and it was they started off every episode with the team huddle in the morning and be
Yeah.
careful out there. So I think we've all taken your advice. We're careful. It's wacky. It continues to kind of keep us all engaged. But I will ask one last question because I know your viewership is at all points in their careers. But what advice do you give to somebody today entering our crazy world of private real estate fund management?
Well, Larry Hull used to say, God gave us two ears and one mouth for a reason. You know, I always tell people the one thing you're never, ever going to hear from another human being is, the problem with you is, David, you just listen too much. You know, there's an old saying in the real estate business that most real estate people are either in one of two conditions. They're either talking or waiting to talk. And I think from the research that we've done into the mind of institutional investors, the thing that investors appreciate the most is to find somebody who's genuinely interested in what they're doing instead of just interested in slinging their products across the table. And so what I tell people is learn how to listen, not to respond, but to listen to understand. And if you do that, half the battle is already won.
Well, that is terrific advice, and I think it's a great note to end on because I will listen, not ask anything further. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I hope your readers and fan club of the last 35 to 40 years will appreciate hearing a little bit about what was behind the creation of what is today an iconic kind of member of the community, not just the institutional real estate letter, but you as well. We can joke about what icon means, but I think you certainly, qualify in the respect of you and your organization have become inseparable. And I know nothing like that stays forever, but when people think of you, they think of institutional real estate. When they think of institutional real estate, they think of you. That is what has made for an incredible run, incredibly successful publication, and expectation, lots more opportunity in the days ahead.
Well, I've been honored to be charged with overseeing an industry that is fascinating, with fascinating, great people in it. That's been a blessing and a privilege and an honor. And along the way, I've had so many people who have helped me, including you. So I thank you to everybody that has been helping along the way. We couldn't have done it without all of you. So thank you.
Well, mutual admiration society here. It's been fun watching the development of you and your company over the years, and I'm looking forward to the next 40. I don't know about you.
I think I'll be
Sign,
around for the next 40.
sign it up, right? Okay, we'll
Well,
leave it at that. We're gonna move off into the crazy world now. But Jeff, thanks again, and look forward to seeing you. And remember, it's a wacky, wacky world out there.
it definitely is. Thank you, David.
All right.